My name is Michael Bryan. So I do some arts admin work at the Village of Arts and Humanities. It's a great arts nonprofit and de facto community development corporation, CDC, up in North Philly in the Fair Hill area, kind of like the northeast corner of the 22nd Police District. And I also have the wonderful privilege of working with a group of folks in Strawberry Mansion and Dr. Bloom and the U.S. Attorney's Office for Eastern Pennsylvania on a really interesting and clever project to bring trauma-informed care to the neighborhood level in Strawberry Mansion and hopefully the rest of the community in North Philly. My introduction to trauma-informed care in the service field and my introduction to the idea of trauma, there's an unofficial start and there's an official start, right? The unofficial start was this time I spent in Miami-Dade County working with an arts nonprofit from New York called a STEP. It's an acronym, stands for Artists Striving to End Poverty. They teamed up with a nonprofit down in Homestead, Florida, that primarily service migrant families, particularly Latino migrant families. I mean, they'd service anyone that needed help, but they would really focus their energy and attention on a population that was particularly underserviced and particularly ignored, but often spoken for in the light of political points, right, about the migrant experience and how migrants are taking jobs and all that other, right? But they really focus on the social services and health and well-being of that population. And I worked in an arts program down there teaching music. And I was introduced to the very real, blunt trauma and traumatic experiences that a lot of Latino migrant families are going through. And particularly those that are also working the farms. And with families that have blended, status in terms of citizenship, and we had a lot of young people who were severely traumatized, leaving school by 7th, 8th grade, living 9 and 10 people in a 2-bedroom house. I had students with no running water, and the two folks who ran the nonprofit down there, In Familia, were a couple, Carlos and Rocio Salgado, and they are pretty amazing people for taking on that job and that role. And Carlos is an arts teacher, and his wife is a therapist, both Colombian migrants. And they briefed us well on what was going on, and it was that was earth-shattering and world-changing for me, because I did that 2 weeks. I left 2 weeks after graduation. I graduated from UArts, so I was excited. Yeah, I went through that experience and came back. I was healed during that experience myself from just a lot of what I experienced growing up in poverty and stuff. My mom's a saint. I always put that in there because people think, you live in poverty, you go through stuff, it's your parents' faults, and that's not always true at all. And when I came back, I was depressed a bit and trying to figure out my place and space in the world and why I felt that way. I could not do what my plan was, and I was really like this. I was just like spinning. But I knew the power of art, and I knew the power of art to create change, and I knew if I stuck in that space, I'd find my answer. And I was at Applebee's, and my friend was a bartender, and she just happened to say, like, what are you doing now? Do you want to, like, come up and volunteer with some kids at this homeless shelter I work at? It's right at Broad and Fairmount. And I was like, yeah, I'm absolutely looking for something to do, and I don't mind volunteering. She was like, yeah, I need, like, positive men up there. They've got to see men, black men, and just be around them, right? And I was like, cool. And long story short, at that point, I went there. I had no idea that they had started this journey of adopting the sanctuary model. I had no clue at 22 what that meant and what that looked like. I just knew I was going up to help with homework and to really teach music. But some of the kids couldn't read, and they were above the age of 7 and 8, and there were kids that were superbly depressed. There was just a lot going on. And they were doing, the institution itself, the Red Shield Family Residence, was doing its best in making these adjustments. And I just, like, jumped in head first. I'm that kind of guy. So I just jumped in headfirst and went for it, and I learned a lot through the sanctuary model. The next part of my journey and this information that I had gathered, really, it was spiritual for me. You know, it's interesting that at this point in my life, that's what I talk about, I think, the most now, and in context of all that knowledge and public education stuff. It was spiritual. It was completely and totally about healing, of course, my own. I focused on everybody else, but realized in that process that if I didn't start healing my own fragmentation, the help I was trying to present to other people would never land properly. It would be tainted with some of my own desires and needs. And so I think that was the first thing, was like recognizing where I needed to change, and that it wouldn't be a 1-year process of change. And it's still going on now, you know, but I'm open to it. And I think that was, you know, honestly, the primary journey. I think the next step was applying all of that stuff and learning to forgive myself and other people over time, particularly ones that might have hurt you, whether that's family, institutions, people. But, you know, trauma-informed care taught me that people are doing the best they can with the knowledge base and the experiences that they have. And that when people feel that any dimension of safety for them is threatened, their behavior is going to help them recreate safety, even if that might mean sometimes they're accosting someone else's safety. That just might not be their lens, right? And so I just learned huge lessons in grace and compassion, because we've got to collaborate to fix anything or to heal collectively as a society. So we built programming that looked at those ideals in practice at Red Shield and challenged the norms for how service delivery would look, and figured out ways to keep pushing with that knowledge and using it to kind of agitate the system at the same time, using it to invite people into new forms of collaboration and new ideas on what could happen, right? We reimagined the entire third floor of the Red Shield. I had a little box of a room to begin with that was dimly lit and had some odd green blue paint, and I could only service up to 12-year-olds. And by the time I left, we had a suite. We had 3 rooms. I had an office space. We had flat screen TVs and computers. We had paint on the wall and paintings everywhere. We had music programs and theater, and we just did a lot. And it was because we weren't scared to try something new. I think Sanctuary helped us with that. It was still scary, but we weren't scared, right? When it comes to changes and systems, you know, I'm pretty young. But I've had the opportunity to work on issues relating to youth homelessness for quite some time. And I think with this knowledge base for me, I'm really looking at the issue of housing insecurity as a bit of a developmental risk cesspool, right? And how does this information on trauma and the impact of trauma and relentless stress on the body and the psyche, how does that play out in this world of housing insecurity? And looking at, you know, likewise, looking at the opportunities for strengthening access and strengthening the nature of protective mechanisms, right, and protective processes. And how do we move from focusing on human survival to human thriving? And what practices and what ideologies do we need to embrace at the individual and the macro level to really usher in large groups of people into that kind of thinking and work process, right? That's the kind of change I'm hoping to bring. And housing insecurity is inclusive of a lot of people, a ton of people, and I have this belief that if we solve that issue, we'll solve about 6 or 7 other issues inadvertently, because there are a lot of things, a lot of pathways that lead to the experience of housing insecurity, right? Low wages, involvement with the juvenile justice or adult justice system, involvement with DHS, neglect and abuse, domestic violence, the identification, right, as being LGBTQ is a huge contributor to youth homelessness, but also a huge contributor to the experience of trauma, right? So if we were to look at housing insecurity as a space of policy that's connected to developmental risk, and like I said, it being more of a cesspool, if you will, of developmental risk, we can then look at the flip side of the protective parts, right? And what might we be able to do to strengthen access and to strengthen just the nature of those mechanisms. So, using art to do that, I think, is another space that I'm really concerned with, and not just connected to the issue of housing insecurity or youth homelessness, but connected to just human thriving at large, right? How do we utilize this fantastic arts culture we have in Philadelphia? How do we utilize this landscape and onboard people into this knowledge of trauma and human thriving, and what emerges from the colliding of those knowledge bases, and what emerges from people collaborating and practicing new ways of service delivery together, reimagining what service delivery looks like, right? That's another big piece of what I'm hoping to contribute to this space. So the connection between arts and trauma, I guess it's answering why it's important to me, or I guess I should answer why it's important to me, right? Narratives are the backbone of humanity. They're the backbone of our collaborative nature. They're the backbone of our inquisitive nature. They're the backbone of us solving problems and communicating information to each other. Well before we were a writing society, we were a storytelling society, right? In so many mediums, through pictures, through language, through dance, through music and song. And it was a form of indoctrination, right, of bringing in the young into the ways of the community and ways of integrating people, right, and delivering their skill sets back to the larger community for the empowerment and the forward movement and momentum of societies and of civilization. And I believe that we have we've not lost the power of the narrative. It's just kind of been sequestered into industry. And that includes the nonprofit industry, right? And I just believe that we have an opportunity to examine where we're at in the 21st century. We have a myriad of tools, technological tools and ways of collaborating and whatnot. We've got the arts in general, and the new mediums that are popping forward and are popping up with technology being introduced, or new forms of technology continually being introduced as time has been progressing. And I think that the journey for us is to really look at how do the arts allow people to work with their autobiographical narrative and to reshape parts of it. What happened to you, but the interpretation of what happened to you, right? That's where we can really help people to empower themselves, right? Give them tools to help them empower themselves and move to a space and place where, the narrative is not in control of them, but they are in control of the narrative and able to use it and manipulate it in healthy ways, right? That move them forward and produce connectivity and can help them, gain access to people that can help them move forward. Because we all need people to move forward, right? No matter where you're at in any kind of hierarchy, we all need people. We need connectivity to move forward. Whether it's a listening ear, a connect for a job, whatever, we all need connectivity. I think the arts help with that. I think they help with a myriad of things, but I think the first level is this point of connectivity and this point of working through narratives and understanding that you have an autobiographical narrative that is always being influenced and is also always helping to shape your behavior and your output, right, emotionally and behaviorally. Yeah. So there are a number of arts organizations in the city who have not run from the challenge of being embedded in spaces that are characterized for their hurt and their pain, because I believe they recognize those as places of great or sheer opportunity, right, for healing and for growth and change and renewal, and in any place of hurt and pain where people have been living for generations and generations, there's this hidden narrative of resilience, right? A hidden narrative of that backbone, right? That hidden narrative of like, I'm still worth it, even if they can't articulate it properly, right? It's still there. And, as an aside, I think that anyone that goes into a community to do a project around change and growth would 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 best service that community and themselves by starting with a question that's more akin to like, what would you keep the same about your neighborhood 50 years from now? What can't change? What do you want to hold on to? And work backwards from there. It's just a bit more of a strengths-based lens and a way to get people to think about the positive things, the joy that life has to offer that can become fleeting when you're bombarded with the tragedy that life has to offer. And so I think there are a number of organizations that work in that space. Mural Arts is one. The Village of Arts and Humanities is another. Freedom Theater has been doing this for decades, arguably the first Black-owned and operated theater in the country. They're approaching 50 years next year. Organizations that, again, center themselves in the midst and the nexus of what it means to be human, really, right? And I've been working diligently at getting this information on trauma and resilience and stress and human growth and thriving to them as much as possible. But anything that I've done has been built on the 75 to 150 to maybe even 250 people that nobody sees. And I think that is another huge point of the arts, right? The connectivity that it brings to people and to mentors, right? Arguably the number one public health crisis we have right now is connectivity, right? Access to supportive, healthy adults for young people, for adults to have peers supportive and healthy that can help them learn new ways of coping, learn new ways of perception and perceiving the things that have happened to them, what's happening currently to them or around them, and collaborative ways of moving forward, overcoming challenges and problems, right? That's what everybody needs, young people in particular. And the arts provides that, and I think there are a lot of agencies that recognize it in themselves. And so for me, it's going out and proselytizing, right? It's going out and making people aware that this nexus of information exists, that they, in particular, as part of the arts and culture community, have a unique and very specific role and set of tools and a skill set and an opportunity that literally does not exist for anyone else but them. And if they do not rise up to that challenge, I don't know who can, So for other for other areas, communities, towns, cities, people looking to collaboratively take on this kind of work, bringing trauma-informed care to neighborhoods or, your whole region. The first thing I'd say is that, well, 1A and 1B, you need to begin your journey with grace and compassion. You need to begin your journey with a ton of humility across the board and recognize that this is a learning journey from the beginning and that everybody has expertise they bring to the table regardless of any academic or professional affiliation. But people might not be equipped with the language to talk about certain things, but that doesn't mean they don't talk about it. And it's our job, those of us who are embarking on this, it's our job to engraft people in on this journey that they might not know is taking place, that wholly involves them already and wholly is about their neighborhood. It's our job to onboard them in a way that is not, I'm going to use a metaphor, that's not like dragging a 2-year-old up the stairs because you want to take 2 at a time. And that 2-year-old, his legs or her legs are only but so big and might just be figuring out how to navigate the stairs. That's just not fair. And so I think that is the crux of advice that I can give. And that regardless of what you know and how long you've been doing it, there are forms of knowledge that can never be introduced into a canon. There are forms of knowledge that can never be completely crystallized, and we have to be okay with that and okay with saying, I might not know that. For all that I know and all that I've done, I might not know this thing or these series of things, and that it's okay to ask for help. Race is a complicated topic. You know, dealing with immigration and migrants, that it's a complicated topic. No one knows everything, and God knows I'm that kind of guy that's like, I want to read everything and try, but I also know I will never know everything. So I have to stick 1 million people around me who are smarter, who are brighter, who have a world of experience that I don't have, so they can tell me when I'm right, when I'm wrong, when I might need to change my perspectives, when I need to grow, when I need to blah, blah, blah. So, you know, I think if people start from that kind of a core and central place, and ask the hard questions up front, just ask them. We are at a point in our society where if healing and growth do not become central to whatever we call policy, we are going to kill ourselves as a species. It's just what's going to happen. And I don't want to see that. And I think a lot of people don't want to see that, right? So I think if we start from that place and are honest about our past, honest about our trauma history as a nation, honest about our trauma history as communities, and honest about the entry point of these varying groups of Americans that have come together to make this country, and what those histories are laden with, and what those paths have kind of been set up with over time, what that means. I think we can make it. That's a 100-year journey, right? But we can do it. So yes, so in this process, I have seen changes happen in Philadelphia. You know, honest confession, what's hard for me is really like taking the time to notice and honor them, because, you know, you're in the throes of the work. And, you know, to me, I have these really hard markers for success and for change. You know, one is no more dead children. And until I'm there, till we're there, right? And until that's a moniker that we all really, we all really believe in, you know, it feels like change hasn't happened. But I recognize it's not, I want to use the word real, right? It's not objectively true, right? Whatever objective means too, right? But it's not objectively true, right? That institutions have been making change. Their language is changing, right? Even the work we're doing in North Philly, to hear people who've never heard any of this stuff a year ago now being able to go to meetings with charter schools and to ask them, are you trauma informed? And they say, well, we have a licensed clinical social worker. And they're like, yeah, but have they been trained to specifically understand types of traumatic experiences that our young people have gone through? Are they trained to handle the impact that it's had on them and how it might show up in the classroom? Like, it's not good enough to just be a therapist. We want to know, can you legitimately handle what the living circumstances are like for these young people? And you know, it's out of their control and et cetera. So that to me is a huge sign and marker for change. It's hard to measure, right? But you get it anecdotally. But that to me is significant, right? Because we're talking about community activists and parents and people that are the brick and mortar of a neighborhood being infused with this information and using it to challenge service delivery, using it to challenge status quo and the normative, quote unquote, normative ways that education is played out, right? Really challenging how that works, and is it possible to even educate a child if they're traumatized and under attack, right, of the stress system in their own body, right? So to me, that's the kind of change that I think we're really looking for. On top of these institutions adopting this language and adopting practices, right? And I think the next marker for change, and this might be unpopular, but I think the next marker for change is getting the bill fronted. You know, some of these policy changes take will and take character shifts and et cetera. Some of them need money to be sustained. You know, Philadelphia is huge. It's 1.5 million people. And I remember reading last year that the city government has a plan to double the population here by 2030, to go up to 3 million people in Philadelphia proper, not greater Philadelphia, but Philadelphia proper in the next 14 years. And there's a gentleman named Christopher Wink who runs awesome dope company called Technically Philly. He wrote this really great article about how Philly could be known as the city for social and civic entrepreneurship because of all of the social maladies and the social inequities that are documentedly here, right? We're more segregated than ever according to the latest census data, and there's a lot of issues here that could be worked out. If we would take that challenge on wholeheartedly and think about the most inclusive, engaging, thriving, healing Philadelphia, and look at all the opportunities and spaces for it in the marketplace, thinking about how ownership over healing mechanisms, what that looks like, thinking about ways to create jobs that also allow community members to be employed in their neighborhood while facilitating that healing, helping to close these knowledge gaps in training so that people can have access to real jobs with real livable wages. We have all of that opportunity here. I think the question for us is going to be, do we have the fortitude to take the time to figure that out? Can we create the time? Because I also hear people in my head going, well, we don't have that time. Well, how do we create that time, right? I just think we have to decide as a society, as a community, as a Philadelphia, that we've hit the bottom here and we're going to ask the hardest questions up front, and we're not going to leave that table until the most inclusive, radical answers are thought of, and we put energy behind moving them forward. And we just say that we're not going to accept, I don't know, or that's not possible right now. And if that means we have to keep figuring out how to pay for it, then we do it. And that might mean new ways have to emerge. And I'm not saying I know them. I think you'd get a lot of people at a table who would be willing to figure this out. You know, and I think you go for it. And it just can't be the city folks, and it just can't be the private sector, and it just can't be the community. That some way, somehow, and again, I'm not saying I know how to do this, but some way, somehow, we've got to figure out how to get all those groups involved and thinking and working and moving together and purposefully looking at what are the ways that we've never tried that theoretically could work, that could move forward in new ways that we've never fully imagined possible. And truthfully, I think that people have imagined certain things they're afraid to talk about. I feel like people have imagined ways forward, including our politicians, that they're afraid might cost them their seat, right? And I honor that, right? It's this fear is real, right? Or not knowing if you'd have the popular support of an idea is real. And I respect that, right? And I don't know that job of being a politician, and it's hard, I'm sure. So this isn't an indictment, but I think it's a space of collaborative ground zero, where we say enough is enough, and we're going to figure this out. if it takes us 3 years to figure it out and emerge a plan, we're going to do that, but we just do it. So it's interesting, right? So to answer a question about my vision for a city that has done those things, right? Adopted trauma-informed care and really looked at these new ways, these third ways of emerging, right? And the reason I say third ways is because we're pretty binary as a society, right? And I think what we're experiencing right now is watching a non-binary system being forced into binary constraints, right? You've got the right and these really diverse opinions, and then you've got the left and these really diverse opinions. And maybe that's been something that's been going on for years, right? I'm only 30 and I'm not gonna claim to be a political historian at all. But it's interesting to watch that really, to me, you've got at least 4 to 5 parties that are spread across 2 parties and trying to force all these opinions into 2 spaces, right? And so when I say third ways, it's just really thinking about these new ways of being that emerge when we release ourselves from these super constraints of a binary system that already are imaginary, right? And so in thinking about these third ways of being for a city like ours, it's hard to answer what that vision looks like because I think it needs to be inclusive of so many people who have been forgotten and not talked about in their histories and blah, 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 just pushed to the side so that certain groups can emerge their visions forward, right? So my vision is something that's so super inclusive that it borderline looks utopian, right? That I would love to read that the murder rate amongst children has dipped to a low that hasn't been seen since the 30s, right? I would love to see that prisons as we know them are obsolete and that we've figured out ways of rehabilitation that allow the most injured among us to become full participating members as much as they can. How we solve the job crisis is going to be really interesting, right? But I think actively looking at other mechanisms of ownership, right? We've got food co-ops. What about mental health co-ops, right? What about healing and art centers designed by young people who have a stake in the ownership and the equity if there's money to be made there, right? What if the prison structure is actually more locally based and not really about prisons, but about communities figuring out with practitioners and with professionals, right? What does it look like for a youth to go to a living space that is so full of nurturing, loving people with structure, because maybe they do need that, but the community has a stake in saying, what do our young people need to heal? Especially when most of the crime is being committed in the neighborhood. It's not being committed 2 cities away. It's not being committed 4 neighborhoods away. Most crime is happening locally. And so if it's happening to people locally, shouldn't they have some say in what rehabilitation looks like? And if they don't have the knowledge base, we can close that. And we can help them figure out what that means and help them design and own locally or collaboratively with other powers, whatever, these types of institutions that could emerge, right? We have to agree that solitary confinement for a child is never okay, no matter what they've done. A child should never be locked in a room for 23 hours. That is unacceptable.